Hi there, it's the third Sunday of Advent, and I thought that I'd share a short reflection on the Gospel reading that's been suggested for today, which is from Luke chapter 3, verse 7 to 18. So feel free to pause the video and start it again once you've read it. Again, we've got a lot of talk about judgment, which might seem a little bit strange in Advent if you're expecting to be hearing about the arrival of the baby Jesus. We don't actually get a lot of talk about that expectation until really next week, the end of Advent. The bigger focus during most of Advent is expectation about the return of Christ, the reign of God, and the realization of true justice on earth. And while that might make us feel a bit uncomfortable, that's actually why we hear a bit about judgment. In today's reading, we have crowds of people leaving the city to go and be baptized by John out in the wilderness, in the Jordan River. But John doesn't welcome them easily. He calls them a brood of vipers. He says, "Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" But before we come to concluding that he's talking about any kind of eternal punishment, I think it's good to keep in mind that this exodus from Jerusalem, from the capital city, to the wilderness, it mirrors events that happened within the memories of the people who would have been hearing Luke's gospel being told. Because between the years 66 and 70, there was a rebellion in Jerusalem, and for a brief period, Jewish forces were able to gain independence from their Roman rulers. However, when the Romans reconquered the city, they had a very harsh vengeance. They destroyed the temple, they killed many of the rebels, and many people fled the city to escape the violence, to escape the wrath of the Romans. So when Luke's community heard this story being told, it'd be hard for them not to be reminded of the flight to escape Jerusalem. With the fall of the city, the destruction of the temple, the killing of Jewish rebels, and the flight of Jewish people into exile, the future of Jewish people would have felt very uncertain. But we shouldn't make the mistake, as Christians have often done in the past, of thinking that this meant that God had replaced Jewish people and that Christians were now God's chosen people instead. We need to remember that the early Christian movement was a movement of Jewish people following a Jewish Christ, even as their convictions about Jesus' divinity started to put them more and more at odds with the wider Jewish community. On the contrary, we shouldn't presume as Christians, if we're Christians, that our own churches will continue forever, even if that's what we've always known. Because changes in our situation mean that the temples that we've depended on, the church buildings we've depended on, no longer define the landscape of our society. We need to pay attention to where we might recognize God's Spirit moving in our wider society now. There might be new things happening. In his own society, John is portrayed as making a whole lot of judgments. However, I would question whether he's condemning people or whether he's warning them of the outcomes of human evil. He tells people that if they have two coats, they should give one of them to someone who has no coat, addressing inequality. He tells tax officials that they should not collect more than they're allowed to, that they should not be making things more difficult for other occupied people, that they shouldn't be driving their neighbours further into poverty for their own profit. He tells soldiers that they should not use their power corruptly. This is what he requires for people who are being baptized. Baptism means dying to the old ways of doing things and rising again to follow a new way. We're raised again to live free of those forms of human evil. It might be uncomfortable for us to recognize this, but inequality, greed, and corruption are problems in our society as well. If we don't address these forms of human evil, if we allow them to continue and to get worse and worse, we do risk the collapse of our society. We need to find ways that we can share what we have. We need to find ways that we can expose corruption and call leaders to integrity. We need to support others in our society who are also working for equality and integrity. John uses the metaphor of fire to talk about the burning away of our sin. And that's probably doesn't sound very pleasant. Change can be painful. But as we know in these lands, if fire is respected and if it's managed well, it plays a role in cleansing the land and making space for new growth, making space where other creatures can graze, making sure that one kind of vegetation is not able to take over and dominate. When children are growing up in our society, we make sure that they learn to be careful around fire and they learn to respect the danger it presents and that they learn to use it safely. We need to listen to First Peoples and learn from them about the best use of fire in these lands. We need to make sure that they're able to care for country and to maintain that responsibility, rather than clinging to the illusion of control that we might have as colonists over the land. This imagery of fire is more like the understanding from the book of Malachi, which came up in one of the readings from last week. This kind of fire cleanses, purifies, refines, strengthens. It's not fire that's out of control. It's not fire that is going to just destroy things. It's fire that's understood and respected and used skillfully. Let's take some time now to be silent and just consider what it is that God's Spirit might be saying to us in our situation today.